I think that what I'm going to say will remind at least one of you, Mark Turner, about something I did 6 years ago in California about the organization of human experience, the cognizable world, in terms of semantic domains. When we cognize, we don't cognize a sort of total fluidum. We have schematizations that are specialized for specific domains of experience. So we don't experience the physical world in the same way that we experience the social world. We have schemas that we develop for each of those subworlds or domains, realms of life world. And then we project them onto each other afterwards, and that's precisely what I think is happening in metaphor, for example. We couldn't do metaphor if there was only one world where things were what they were, etc. Also, we can see that when we develop categories and terminologies for categories, we are doing so by domains. And that's why we can do metaphor, namely by developing specific terminologies for different domains and then project them to each other, so that we can understand one. It's not only about one concrete domain in terms of abstract domains, but it's also the case that there are several equally concrete domains, and there are several abstract domains, and it turns out that metaphor runs up and down and around in a larger architecture of possible domains, and that's also true for time concepts, in fact. So let's see if I can show you something of this. So I have time in the plural here also. So I'm going to show you some standard examples of representations that you will find also in classrooms where languages are taught, and you try to make clear what the meanings are of terms related to time. There are 4 basic domains that are distinguished by different uses of basic closed class terms, including modal expressions, by the way, and time expressions. Of course, modality is about forces and movement, and time is about another aspect of the same thing, namely motion. So it's not that's surprising. Here's a standard. Time is linear. Q is after P and before R. That's important for ordinary orientation in physical space, because we will have to rotate, just like we rotate landmarks when we move around in a landscape and we want to find our way back. If we have a list of landmarks, then we have to rotate the list of landmarks in order to find our way back. It's still the case when we try to navigate in urban landscapes and so on. This is a particular very simple scheme, in fact, that we need to have, and languages have prepositions for it, like before and after and so on. And I think that when we are back to such an elementary level, it's not a matter of specialization at all. I mean, after means after in time, really. This is time, and it's morphologically represented by time expressions that are really time expressions. So we don't have to conceptualize time in terms of space. Otherwise, we would say if we were radically forced to think time in terms of space, why don't we think that time is space then? Because there is something particular to time, and it has its own schematization. Of course, you would say, isn't that a path? Okay. I don't know if it's a path. It doesn't resemble a highway in Cleveland, but it resembles some sort of geometric representation. Now, geometric representations are things that we gesturally do in time, like this, for example, on a plane. We could call that space, but it's not the space we are living in. It's a gestural time. It's a sort of graphic medium which is different from any realistic notion of time. I don't live in such a thing, even if I call that the timeline of my life. It's not space. It's really time, I would say, as temporal as it can be. Then there is the social domain, which is also concrete and basic, and it has something like an aspectual organization of time this time. Something like, here is Jensen doing something and here's Petersen doing something. Now, while Jensen is doing what he's doing, then Petersen comes in and does what he's doing. So he's doing, while S1 is doing something, S2 is doing something else. Now, while is an old, if you study etymology, an old noun and an old verb that exists in the Nordic languages. It's called hvile, and hvile means to rest. And well, you have to set S1 into the mode of doing what he's doing, and let him rest in that position until S2 is doing what he's doing, and then he stops, for example. Social life is essentially about waiting for each other, so that we can collaborate. We have to be in the same spots in order to find each other useful for doing anything together. So while is a very important temporal basic notion for social concepts of time. Social concepts of time at that basic level. Social concepts are, I would say, aspectual, and we have languages that give privilege to the aspectual morphology instead of giving privilege to the separation of the past and the future and stuff like that. There are ways to be real, not only in terms of tense, but in terms of inchoative, durative, iterative, terminative, etc. aspects, and those are the socially important ones. It's also the ones that govern temporal embedding in language, because temporal embedding in language reflects the ways in which we are waiting for each other, in fact. So that's a fundamental one, I would say. We could symbolize it in ways like this, and that's what you find in literature by grammarians. The third one would be the interpersonal domain, where I and you are not necessarily waiting for each other, but we have to address each other intentionally in a very species, particularly species present, I would say, namely the something like the encounter of gazes, which is not waiting for each other, one staring on the other for half an hour and then the other coming back to him. So there is a difference, which is also the difference we find in the modal manifestation of domains between the social domain and the interpersonal domain. Interpersonal domain expressions include speech act expressions. For example, in the modal world, we could say, you can't step into this room with your shoes on. Why can't I do that? Because it's a temple. It's not because I say so, it's because that's the convention for this spot, for this place. That's social. But I can also say, for example, you can come in now. And my students will say, why can I come in now? Well, because I say so. That's different. It's not a social convention, it's a speech act. It's easy when I present it this way, to see the difference between speech acts and social conventions. Social conventions refer to the speaker as the direct authority, and that's the sort of time we have here. Therefore, I can't, for example, do a speech act in a social mode. For example, I promise you again and again that I will do this. That's not a speech act, because again and again is aspect, it's iterative. And I can't use an iterative in a speech act. Why? Because it's not social, it's interpersonal, it's here and now. So it has a time pattern based in a deictic present. I imagine something like a purple window of 3 seconds, because it takes some time to realize the presence, the intentional presence of the other's mind in your space. Takes time in neural terms. And then it projects, of course, a little bit to both sides, so I can promise and I can fear and I can hope and stuff by projection. But basically, the here and now, hic et nunc, is a model that's different both from the aspectual and from the sequential time. So normally we have to use this when we teach what Roman Jakobsen called the shifters, like now and here and then, etc. Then would be somewhere else. By the way, it's easy for me to do the future like this. Like, for example, I don't want to talk about the future. It's sufficient to be negative. So I think that Nunes and Switzer should have manifested the whole sentence for us to see if it was positive or negative. But I think we can easily go back to the sources on that. Of course, it's easy to combine affirmative and negative expressions with temporal expressions, and then we get gestures that combine the two. The fourth basic domain, which is also concrete, so the social and the physical and the speech act and the mental domain are primary. It seems also to be the case that the distinction between the external worlds and the internal world is very early realized by infants. So it is really basic in terms also of development. Here's the mental domain where we would say something happens now and then. Now and then is a temporal expression. Something happens often. Often is not spatial. Something happens rather seldom. That's temporal. It's not spatial. There are a lot of expressions that are purely temporal. They are born temporal. It's only about time. So what does the mind do? Something like, here's an event, and it hits reality from time to time. Bang, 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 bang. And then it goes out again. Just like a comet hitting into our solar system and then out again somehow. So we seem to be able to distinguish the idea of an event, the identity of an event and its realization. So it's also real when it's not manifested. It's just somewhere else. It's of course mental, and it's one of the roots of abstraction, I think. Something like thinking of something which is not the case is thinking of something that sometimes is the case. Even if it's never the case, it's just the same model with very few stars on it. But it's still a graphic model like this. Those are the basic we have found so far. And then there seem to be, on top of the basic set, some domains that are slightly more abstract in themselves. We know that because we have terminologies for them. For example, in the physical space, in the social space, in the speech act space, there are no divinities. But what our ancestors apparently did was to combine the physical and the interpersonal domain. So they went out into nature and talked to the spirits there. Spirits have places, as you know, so we go into those places and talk to them. Go out of the spaces, they are no longer listening. That's ordinary animism, which is all over the place. We are still animists in many domains. And that's a way of combining the two domains, and it turns out that what our minds are doing is to combine the schemas from the two source domains for this one. So you get a very important one, namely a here and now, which is now a meeting point between two cycles. The cycles are, of course, sequential. But the immense advantage of this sort of organization is that now you can symbolize and refer to times, because they can have names. They can't have names if they sequentially don't come back. But if you transform the line into a cycle, of course, a cyclical event can have an identity. A unique and singular event can't have a name. I mean, this moment doesn't have a name because it's unique and singular. It doesn't come back. So we don't call it Peterson, for example. Remember Peterson? That was, I mean, it has to come back in order to be something we can celebrate. So the next question is, of course, in this domain, how it happened in the sacred domain. Well, it happened because celebration of the dead, celebration of specific mythical events have times and places in time where they occur. We can't, for example, remember our ancestors every day because there are too many ancestors and too few days for that. So it'll be completely chaotic. No, we have to distribute them over over time. Also, we can't have a party every day because of all these ancestors. We would die of hunger. No, not possible. So we have to distribute them, and I think that the source inspiration here comes from bodily practices where we are already doing this, namely where we have multi-cycle practices of time, namely in dance and music. We know that dance and music happens in all societies known to this day, every one, even those that have no elaborate mathematics. But we know that those that have elaborate mathematics, like the Aztecs, for example, have calendars, and those have been generated by priests. And priests are doing both the dancing and the calculating. Now, I know from jazz music how easy it is to shift from a numerical system to another, from a 10 system to a 12 system, where we count by 12 instead of by 10, or to a 2, or to a 3 or 4. So we count, for example, 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, because I count both 1, 2, 3, 4, and then I count the next sign, and then I count the next sign. So times have two names, one for the internal beat and one for the number of the bar. So we count, and then we count bars in choruses, and choruses in larger movements. And that's how dancers have to do in order to not have to wait for each other too long. Because they have to be on the beat together if they want to dance together. Try a tango where you have to wait half an hour for a step by the other. It's hopeless. You have to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 2, 3, 4 in tango. And you have to be on the beat, and otherwise it won't work. To be on the beat is to be where the partner has the beat. And the partner will be where you have the beat. So there's an objective, there is a beat, and the persons jump into that beat. That's objective time already. It's a philosophical miracle that elephants can't do. They can do music by rubato procedures, but they can't do swinging music. Even bonobos can't swing because they don't get this, which is a fantastic thing. I think that we can go from numerical time in rhythm to, derived from dance, to calendars, in fact. Calendars are just expanded versions of dancing. So you see, for example, the ancients talking about cyclic events all over the place, even the movements of the sky, the planets, etc., the music of the spheres and so on. That's an expansion of dancing. As bodies can dance, they can have rhythm. And the next thing is they can call a beat something when the beat comes back. So we can call them 1, 2, 3, 4, or Petersen, Jensen, Frederiksen, Hansen, if you want to. Or you see, for example, days in weeks, in some calendars, weeks are equal to months. But then we have Mars and Venus and so on, and we have Odin and Thor, etc., on the days. So the gods are going to be celebrated on the days that have their names. Catholics do use the same cycle on years. So if you are on Marie's day, you'll have to do something to Marie's, etc., and on and on. Days and proper names are basic forms of symbolization. So the numerical time, I think that this is one of the origins of mathematic concepts of number. Should be considered, in fact. I think Lakoff and Nunez are getting there slowly by referring to walking But I think that dancing is better than walking because you have to be on the beat, which separates the concept from your clumsy personal movements. Marching is better because it is dancing. Okay, so this one is particularly important, I would say. And then the political world, which is physical, of course, because it's about a territory, and the territory has a group on it. And what happens is that you get a spectral time and sequential time, and you get what we call historical time. So, for example, S was still in A, but already in B. That's Louis XVI, right before the French Revolution, for example. It was still working, but something was going on, and Carpe Diem will work, something like, well, in the personal register, we would say, you are still beautiful, but already getting old, so if you want to love me, better do it soon. Something, that's historical time, where you get sequential time and the spectral crossing into each other, in fact, and that's slightly more abstract, of course, than the basic patterns I showed you before. But it is, of course, a basic cultural domain. The sacred, the political. The sacred would have to do with worship, the political with work, of course. The logic of the world in which we work is a political logic. And then the domestic, families, kinship relations, memories, hopes and fears. It's something like, I'm born here and I'm going to die there. So this is the maximal extension of a present. It's less specious than in James's times, etc. But okay, it's expandable, and it's a biographical expansion of the deictic, which can include references to a present embodying a lot of persons, namely all of those that I know, etc. So we are here now, a sort of extended we. By the way, from here we could go to the problem of a symbolized past. So a group of people, for example, an expansion into ethnic identity of the we here now, would go to shared memories that would be triggered by shared emotional tags. So it's full of emotional tags on both sides here. You just push the button and you get a lot of mythology coming up, etc. So it contains references to past moments that you can reactualize and re-theatricalize. Todd and I are working on hypotheses for the moment as the way in which we technically do this, where we remember in a theatrical way that allows us to be Louis XIV and Louis XVI and to be old Kant and all this and have debates with them in as a structure of this kind, which is different from what we have seen in the other schemas. Now what I just did was simply to take the basic domains, the red ones, and then study what happens to them when we combine in the first order of cultural domains, namely the sacred, domestic and political, where we live in three modes that we know from all societies and in an anthropological framework, namely that there must be frameworks for work, for love and for worship of some kind. That's the minimum there is. And time articulations and schematizations follow this completely. So that's what languages will come up with in morphologies and terminologies of all kind. And I just wanted to give you that as a special domain. Thank you.
I have, okay, Karen, go ahead. I got lots of, no, you go ahead. I don't want to.
It's fascinating. It was an observation on your first domain. And it just links back to something that Jonna was mentioning. I used to listen to this chap called Clive Wearing, who ran.
Oh yes. Yes.
And it's an observation recently. He had a music program called Kaleidoscope, and I used to listen to it all the time. Then he had an outbreak of herpes simplex in his brain, which wiped out the hippocampus, much of the temporal lobes, and then the anterior frontal lobes, which meant that as a case he was left without any short-term memory, any long-term memory. He didn't transfer, but also his episodic memories were wiped out. So he literally was captured in the 45 minutes. Mm-hmm. Jonathan Miller, the director and doctor, made a wonderful film of that. And then subsequently, it just happened I met Miller and asked him where Clive Wearing was, because I thought his wife couldn't cope with the consequences of being emotionally greeted as though she hadn't seen him, or he hadn't seen her rather, for the first time in years, and it happened every 2 minutes. So he eventually went into a home. Recently she wrote a book, now this is 20 years afterwards, and it's just in connection with the point that Husserl is making, that there's time consciousness built into self-consciousness. And the idea is that, and I think James had the same idea, that in the stream of consciousness, each present moment recruits the past in some way. It appropriates it, it owns it, but it also has an anticipation. And in music, and this is why I'm mentioning the point, Clive Wearing's musical memory was intact. So he could conduct. He was the world expert or European expert on lassos. So he had those abilities. But as the years have gone on, and this was the intriguing thing, the question was, would he change in any way? Now, the clinical psychologists weren't picking up changes, but the recent book that his wife had, if you're thinking of say, the Husserlian idea of retention, the present moment, and the potention as somehow a moment of anticipation that was going to get the next moment to keep the stream running. If you're musical, you will have a sense of what's coming next without any verbal articulation of it. And what his wife noticed in recent years, which was really interesting, was he had regularly watched the same video without any memory of it. But he began, she noticed, to anticipate the scene change visually in the same way that you would temporally expect it musically. And I just put that as an observation of a kind that clinical psychological assessment won't pick up, but a lover will.
Well, it could be due to the fact that there could be a problem with this one, but then he could still do this one.
Well, I think he can do the first as well, but without articulation.
Well, there's some I mean, the book is called Forever Today by his wife, yes. But I think that there's another exception in the fact that the only thing he recognizes is obviously the music. He's completely fluent. But also he recognizes her.
Oh, he certainly recognizes her. But she notices that when he's watching videos, he has a sense of, now that's new. How does he learn that?
Well, it's very interesting but he has very, very strongly that sort of 3 second he sort of wakes up, and when you read those observations, it's 5:42 and I've just woken up, and it's 5:43 and I've woken up.
But it's a 45 second, but within that 45 seconds, seeing repeatedly a video which comes after his injury, somehow he is beginning temporally to anticipate in her observation the next scene. So what is happening that allows him to do that potentive, anticipatory thing?
Well, it's an interesting thing that just parenthetically, since you're talking about Clive Wearing, I have some of that video material, and I use it in teaching all the time. And for those of you who have never seen the video, it's very moving because his wife enters the room and he embraces her as if it's the first time he's seen her since his injury or since his illness, and this has happened to her hundreds and hundreds of times, and of course it's unbearable for her, but for him it's equally exciting, and he doesn't habituate, he just keeps. So in a sense there's no emotional memory that habituates, and had it been simply a normal emotional memory, there had been some storage, it would have diminished even if he wasn't able to recall that he'd had the experience before, but even that is absent. So it's a remarkable thing, and yet, and this is the point I want to raise here, his mastery of language is unaffected. So his linguistic conceptualizations have absolutely no power to carry him through or to be a substitute for the more basic intellectual or cognitive capacity to stitch together experiences in time. In other words, I would argue that this kind of episodic memory undercuts language, is more fundamental, and is not sufficient to construct time in its own right. So you could almost take that case as an argument against an explicitly or exclusively episodic notion of time perception. I wanted to ask you a point, just a point that I think where your work converges with my own, and that is, I proposed some years ago that the move towards language was initiated by a sort of stitching together of the motor and the perceptual brain, if you want, and that led to a kind of mimetic culture in which rhythm, although it didn't evolve in its own right, was a signature, a giveaway that this kind of integration was occurring. And so some of the things that you're saying about rhythm and about the fundamental nature of movement and dance and so on, and how uniquely human it is, resonate with me very, very much. I like that idea. But anyway, I noticed a number of hands up, so yes, Mark.
I'm always in awe of your creative productivity, poetic and taxonomic. And you have laid out 3 cultural domains, the sacred, the political, and the domestic. And of course, I'm entirely convinced it's fabulous. But, sort of why these 3? Why not the pedagogical, the travel, and the narrative? I'm completely convinced this is terrific.
No, that's true.
I'm sure I'm going to be quoting you in an article. But how did you get to these 3? What's the analysis behind it?
Well, anthropology started in the 1860s by Taylor and others. And they tried to find out what's basic in a society. Is that there are individuals in there, of course. And they, of course, noticed that these individuals will have to reproduce in order to be there some years after that. So they noticed that there are kinship structures. And they noticed that work is necessary in order for these kinship structures to produce enough to be able to reproduce. And some of them had read Marx and others who had tried to find out what the fundamentals of societies are, etc. Marx didn't like very much the third one, namely the worship. Stalin was more happy about that one later because the Central Committee was a good object for worship, of course. Well, the thing is that those are anthropological basics, in a sense, that have been studied over and over again in the 20th century. We have the works of Benveniste and of Dumézil, the basic institutions. Dumézil studies on the Indo-European basic institutions, and over again. There's a huge literature about that. The interesting thing is that they are also related to semantic domains. We have to argue about that, of course. We have to see what the criteria are. We have terminologies. For example, in nature there are no uncles, because that's not a physiological notion, etc. There are individuals, etc. Kinship structures have them, but that's a different domain. And people seem to have been sufficiently aware of the domain difference to create different terminologies for these things. Also a different syntactic formula for what people can do to each other, with each other, for each other, etc. All these formulas in syntax about exchange. The dative, for example, is of little use in nature, where people are just eating each other out there. So
I want to get as many people in as I can before we move on to the next speaker. There were other questions. Yes.
How before you had the slide of the timeline?
the first one.
Yeah.
The very first one.
There's one with the brackets. The curly brackets.
The social brackets. The political brackets. This one.
Yeah. How does that and what did you have the both actions happening at the same time rather than as two separate actions?
Well, it's a spectral and it's still sequential. So this is just an example of it, of course. It's not the only formula there. You can have periods, ages, Middle Ages here, and then you have the Renaissance here, and then you have etc. Nicely bracketed off from each other. But normally you would have to work on overlaps if you are in historiography, of course. In everyday life, that would be the carpe diem, as I said, a formula for stress. Something like hurry up, deadline. There's a deadline here. Something like that, where something expires, could be a grant. And you have just started on your work, and the rest of the work will be in free air, you know. That's social, political time, in a sense, so it has to find something else, which is a huge syntax of bracketing and more bracketing when you think historically.
I wanted to raise an issue that there was an apparent contradiction between Faye's statement that gestural representation of time is spatial and your argument that in fact it's not spatial in language, that it's rather different. And I wanted to make the suggestion that maybe it's the case that gesture is inherently spatial because it's body-based, it's embodied, whereas language is in a sense disembodied. That is, it allows you to abstract to a higher degree, and so that language would naturally contain a lot of spatial metaphors simply because on an embodied level, that's one of the options available. Whereas in the case of language, especially speech, it's no longer harnessed to spatial metaphors entirely, although it will naturally borrow many that are existing. And I'd like both of your comments on that suggestion, actually.
What I'm saying is only that it's not space in the same sense. When I say we are going to start the music on the same beat, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Right.
Is that space? Not to me. It's gesture, but it doesn't mean that that a beat is vertical. It just means where it is in time. As to what it means, it's temporal, of course. What I did was a spastic movement in time, okay, in the space of a body. That's true. But I would say to Faye that there is, of course, the sagittal and there is the transversal. There is also a frontal screen, like in centimeters it would be 40 to 60, something like that. When I say, for example, the fence runs all the way down to the river, I use the frontal screen, which is only in 2 dimensions, and I do the contours with my finger. That's graphic. It's not a good space because it's only got 2 dimensions.
If I'm right,
it's graphics.
In the gesture literature, baton gestures are separate from all the others. Is that not correct?
No, I wouldn't say that's correct.
No? Okay. So expostulate.
So I think possibly rhythm is something special, and I think that I was talking to someone about this earlier, maybe Peter Whitehouse. So I think it's going to be sort of difficult to unify rhythm and
I think rhythm is the base of real abstraction.
yeah, possibly, but
We can understand it as being objective, but it has no extension. In that sense, it's Cartesian. It's res cogitans. That's cogitans. I don't have to do anything. I can just say 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4,
Let Faye complete her thought.
and I did nothing.
Yeah.
trying to formulate this thought and didn't do it quickly enough. Maybe rhythm is as close as we can get to a completely non-spatial conceptualization of time. And maybe there's a unifying bridge through gesture to the more spatial versions.
And fetuses in utero
Yeah, and I'm certainly
may
thinking
have
about
rhythm
your comments earlier.
in ways that we would not characterize as characterize as spatial.
But I think that there are static conceptualizations of time that are spatial, so I'm not sure that I agree that the dynamic dimension is the
You're
most
on.
essential.
Just to add to Perot's argument, the philosopher Suzanne Langer, when she looked at various art forms, talked about primary illusions, and the strongest of them all for her, because it was the one she spent most time, was on music. And it's interesting. And for her, the primary illusion that was expressed by music was time, not space.
Yeah.
So I just mentioned that your argument coming very strongly in favour of time and its primacy, and your coming from within music, are not accidental, obviously.
No.
But Langer, I think, had a very strong sense of what that was about, and rhythm was part of this, but also that anticipatory dimension.
It's interesting in modern music when rhythm goes out and you play something where you can't count, really.
Yeah.
Then it becomes program music, it becomes iconic. And you have to imagine a landscape and stuff. That's very typical.
Well, one more question.
Can I ask, in the instance of space, I think the magnetic field is presumed there. Is the magnetic field part of the gesture of time?
The magnetic field of the Earth is what you
Yeah.
mean. That's an interesting concept. In gravity-free environment, would gestures be different? Interesting idea.
They might still
Be egocentric, but indifferent as to sagittal versus et cetera, et cetera. That's
We know that gravity is at the base of a lot of basic proto-metaphorical concepts. When the prices go up, and when a melody goes up, it's about gravity. So you have a lot of birds up there, and then you have an elephant down there, etc. That's gravity in music. So that's what Larry Spikovsky was talking about, verticality in pitch, for example. Whereas the instruments can be horizontal, so it's not drawn from there. It's really a cognitive, auditive.
But I suppose I'm trying to tease out if that is the separation between time and space, is that reference to gravity, to the magnetic field. If our concept of space relates to the magnetic field, and our concept of time in relation to space has nothing to do with the magnetic field.
It's a good idea, or to gravitation as such. No, we could say if we do a graphic line and think of it as an abstract graphic, it has no gravitation, in a sense.
Well, I can't help but
That's a possibility.
As I think we have to move on to the next speaker, and this is an interesting topic, which.
Okay.